I'm finally home after visiting Glasgow, Liverpool and Manchester, and I now want to investigate Cardiff in more detail. I'm back at the Cardiff Story Museum to meet a man whose name has popped up a fair few times during this past week, Neil Evans. Neil, thank you so much for coming to Cardiff to visit us today.
You're welcome.
I really appreciate it. It's an honour to have you here. I was wondering if you could tell me a bit about the riots that took place here in Cardiff.
The riots in South Wales started in Newport in early June 1919 and then spread to Barry and finally to Cardiff, where they reached their peak. The greatest violence was in Cardiff. But of course you have to remember that they were the culmination of a much wider process in the British ports from January onwards, where the first incidents occurred in South Shields and in Glasgow. And there'd been major riots in Liverpool shortly before those in Cardiff. And I think we have to place them in an even wider context, really. We have to think about the British Empire and what was happening to that during the First World War. Britain had just won the First World War, along with France and the United States and the other powers, of course, but very much because of the role which imperial forces played within it.
So what sparked the riots here in Cardiff?
The first incident happened on a June night after a group of black sailors and their white wives and girlfriends had been out for a picnic. So one of the first sparks was really, I think, to do with the fact that there were mixed race relationships produced by the expansion of the black population of Cardiff in the war. The riots in South Wales were by far the most violent throughout Britain. Altogether 4 people died in South Wales and only 5 throughout Britain in the whole of the riot. So there's one death in Liverpool and 4 in South Wales. They do seem to get violent as they snowball through the ports from January through to June 1919 and then end with what happens in Cardiff effectively.
The archive material mentioned Cardiff a lot in all of those areas. So if I was in Glasgow, it would refer back to Cardiff. Liverpool would refer back to Cardiff, but never really about each other. But everywhere we went, there was a huge pull for Cardiff. Why was that? Is that because of the export that went on here?
Yeah, it's a very important feature of Cardiff is that it's virtually entirely an export port. It had something like 90% of its trade was in exports and only about 10% in imports. But its huge movement was in coal, and coal went across the world. Now, this meant that if a sailor wanted a ship, Cardiff was the place to go to because there were always ships looking for crews. That may have affected the way the riots developed because there is a movement of sailors between the ports. We shouldn't think that they were just sailors who came into Cardiff or into Liverpool. Sailors were highly migratory and moved between places. Even if they were based in Cardiff, they might be signed off somewhere else.
Am I right in saying that when they brought people over from the colonies, black people over from the colonies, to support during the war, the merchant shipping trade and working on the docks and so on, that they were expecting after the war for them to return back home, and they weren't really prepared for those people wanting to actually settle here in Cardiff?
And I think you always have to remember that the British Empire was made up of far more black people than of white people. And it was based on the idea that they traded freely with each other. So while a lot of people might have wanted to send black people back at the end of the war, they were also concerned that they gave the right image of the empire, that it was free for all its citizens to move to. Being too restrictive about black people in Cardiff was not really on the agenda, in the sense that the repatriation would always have to be voluntary and inducements were offered to go back.
What was it that made the riots spread across Britain?
Well, one thing which would have spread the riots between ports was the normal movement of sailors between the ports and the stories which would have been told. And of course, the incidents which happened elsewhere figured in the press. As the year 1919 advanced, of course, there would be more and more soldiers discharged from the army and sailors discharged from the navy. So there were lots of unemployed ex-servicemen on the streets and full of resentments about how they'd been treated in the war, at not having jobs to come back to. And many of those, they could hang on the black sailors who were seen as benefiting from the war.
What were the results of these riots? What happened after the riots, particularly here in Cardiff?
The major long-term consequence was that the black population was confined to Bute Town again after being more fluid and more dispersed during the First World War. It's very much about defining where black people are allowed to live in Cardiff, and that's a unique feature in Cardiff, I think, because it had all those physically distinctive features, the railway lines and the canal, which cut Bute Town off from the rest of the city. It was possible to segregate there in a way which it wasn't quite the same in Liverpool or in South Shields. One of the consequences, of course, was the migration into Cardiff was almost exclusively of men. There were very few black women, so that inevitably raised the issue of interracial marriage and relationships. I think the other thing is that it was long in the memory. By the 1960s, what happened in 1919 had been largely forgotten. And when I became interested in it in the late 70s, it almost seemed to have been unknown. The great journalist and folk song collector Bert Lloyd, who wrote about Bute Town in 1950, he said that people remembered with bitterness what had happened in 1919. So it's 4 days on the streets, but a long time in the memory that reverberated for a long time afterwards.
Well, Neil, thank you so much. I believe we're going to go out now and have a wander through Bute Town and just have a look at where those riots took place.
Some of the initial attacks were on areas like that where black people were much more vulnerable and exposed because they were settled amongst other white people.
Yes.
And it was very hard for the police to protect them there.
Yes.
In Bute Street to the south and Bute Town, which was physically cut off in many ways from the city and easy for the police to barricade, it was much easier for them to defend. So we know that during the course of the riots, many people moved from this area south into Bute Street for protection. Bute Street was the main thoroughfare between the docks and the centre of the city in the 19th century. These days it's largely bypassed by Lloyd George Avenue, but it was a main thoroughfare in the day. It's a one-sided street. There's the embankment on the far side opposite us here, which carried the Taffrail Railway. That is, it carried most of the coal from the valleys into Cardiff docks. And on the other side, three-storey houses which had shops and pubs and boarding houses attached to them, and was seen as the centre of Cardiff's demi-monde or nightlife. There was a lot of exaggerated discussion about how the place was a danger to the morals of the city and to the whole life of the city. This went on for 100 years and more, but it was always greatly exaggerated. The police said in 1919 that the population here was quite heavily armed, and one reason why they defended the entrances to Bute Street so heavily was they were afraid of the carnage that would happen if the white rioters came in and the black people defended themselves.
But people did make it through because the houses here were attacked, weren't they? Some even set alight.
Some were in Bute Street here, roughly in this area. It's very hard to determine where you are these days because the landscape has changed so much. It was very easy for the police to defend the community in 1919 by putting cordons around areas like this. You can see how restricted the entrances are.
Yeah.
And we've got, almost a mile of wall on either side of it.
Yes.
So the area was physically apart. That's a very important feature of what goes on in Cardiff as compared with the other ports where there were riots.
So they would block this off. So where would this have led to?
On the other side of this, there would have been houses, warehouses. There were lots of warehouses and the other features of the docks. But it was not open to the rest of the world. That's the important point. But, there would have been many warehouses, and the flour mills were across there, Spiller's flour mills on the other side. You can still see the remnants of those on the other side of Lloyd George Avenue.
And then if we look ahead of us here, we are back facing the other side of the bridge, that we were talking about on Caroline Street when we were at Caroline Street. So that shows the distance, the close proximity.
Yes, it's very short distance, less than a mile, I should think. And that bridge carries the main South Wales Railway across, and it's on embankment, so it's very hard. Again, that's a physical barrier which was difficult for people to get through, so the police could put a cordon on that bridge fairly easily. To be in Butetown was to be on the wrong side of several different sets of tracks and canal.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to come and walk through Butetown with me.
Thank you.
It has changed significantly.
Yeah.
So it's been a couple of months since I went around Britain investigating the riots, and I'm here piecing it together. And I just feel like there's something missing. I mean, I've got information on the riots themselves and the rebellion that took place in the seaports of Britain, but I'm reading a book here that was written by my dad called The Mossad 1919, More Than Just a Riot. And there's a section in here that talks about the 1981 Mossad uprising. And it says, on the evening of the 18th of July 1981, the Committee of Mossad witnessed a rebellion by young people, mainly black, but with sizable numbers of whites, especially Irish, also involved. There have been similar rebellions in St Paul's, Bristol, Brixton, London, and Toxteth, Liverpool Lake, which is one of the places that we visited, and a number of other areas in England. So this is again something that's spread across the country. So even in just reading this and flicking through the book, it makes me want to go and maybe speak to my dad and put some of this into perspective, because things didn't actually change that much. So I think I'm going to take a trip to London and see if I can grab my dad for 5 minutes and talk to him about this book and about the state of play in Britain after 1919. So Dad, I've been travelling around doing this documentary. I've been to Glasgow, Liverpool, Manchester, and of course Cardiff. And I just didn't feel satisfied that I'd found out all of the information, and wanted to come and talk to you about the aftermath of the riots that took place in 1919, what happened in the decades that followed here in Britain and of course in the colonies.
Many more people than in 1919 were demobbed. By many more people, I mean people of African heritage. They came to join Britain in waging that awful war. More of them died than survived. When they did come back from fighting in Europe or wherever and started to join civil society in this country, particularly in these major cities, London, Liverpool, Glasgow, Cardiff. The resistance on the part of the local population was fierce.
So why do you think the local population were so reluctant to accept the contributions of black people in the war effort?
There were a whole number of reasons for that. But the principal one being the racism that was endemic within the society. So although everybody knew that those people had gone and on the killing fields of Europe had lost mates, comrades, relatives even, that was not enough to bind them to the nation as far as white people were concerned. And therefore, the deprivations that the working class people were suffering was such that rather than blaming the aristocrats and the ruling classes and the state, they found their comrades in arms who were black to be the natural enemy.
So are there any parallels between the riots in 1919 and those that then came after it through the decades?
There are many parallels between 1919 and subsequent riots, uprisings. It didn't matter how poor white people were. They saw black people as not just very different, but the cause of the misery. Many of those later riots had to do with they really were protests against the way the police were treating black people. St. Paul's, Bristol, 1980. Brixton, Liverpool, Manchester, Moss Side, Birmingham, 1981. There's a pattern to all of that, which is about the state and its control institutions and the way they choose to treat black people because we are seen as marginalized and other. In the period after 1919, one couldn't depend on the courts to mete out justice to the black people who were involved. The police treated them abysmally. The courts endorsed what the police were doing. And many of them ended up in jail for no other reason than that the court system determined that they should make an example of them. The country is in a far worse state than it was in 1919. There has been such a conflation of immigration and xenophobia. In 1981, Margaret Thatcher talked about British culture being swamped. In 2015, David Cameron is talking about swarms of people coming from Syria and those conflicts into the European Union and wanting to come into Britain. Okay, I mean, bees swarm, for God's sake. Not people fleeing armed conflict and, escaping for their lives, risking their lives in order to come and find freedom. And that is why it is so critical for us to identify those systemic elements and understand the context in which they manifest, the history of them, and sadly, why if we don't learn that history and seek to dismantle those elements, inevitably, inexorably, it will happen again. It's cyclical,
Thank you so much, Dad, for just shedding more light on that. And it's been great having an opportunity to come and visit you finally.
I can go on forever.
Yeah. No, but thank you. I really appreciate that.
Good. I hope it helps. I hope you can use it and splice it as you wish to help complete the telling of your story.
On the way home, I visited the West Indian Ex-Services Association, which is a charity set up to provide food, shelter and support to West Indian war veterans. Now, although they didn't have any information pertaining to the riots specifically, they were able to share photos and information on black ex-servicemen from World War I and World War II. It was so sad to see a room full of black men who fought for this country and yet believe that their service and that of those who fought before them still goes unrecognised. I'm going to head back to Cardiff now. This trip to London has definitely been worthwhile. Where I thought I would be coming to the end of a journey, I find it's only just beginning. Making this documentary has been an eye-opening experience and taught me so much about my own heritage here in Britain. I'm not going to lie, it's had its highs and its lows. The highs being me learning of the successes of black people here in Britain, information they should have taught me in school, but that's another matter. The lows? Learning of the struggles that black people faced fighting to be accepted into a country that many black people died fighting for, which leads to even more frustrations. I mean, why has it taken a local community group in Liverpool to get that portion of black history into the archives? And more importantly, at what point did those documents become separated from those that sit in the main archives that historians and students reference for accurate accounts of British history? For me, the 1919 race riots are just one example of how racial prejudice has spilled into violent outbreaks over the past century. I just hope that with what's currently happening in Britain and the varying attitudes towards race and national identity, that we can take some valuable lessons from the past. I'm going to continue my research and put together an education resource pack which will enable teachers to take this information and give a more accurate account of 20th century Britain. And on a more personal note, I'm going to carry on my search and celebrate the contributions of black people here in Britain.